I had these thoughts about stories. In a sense, we're always thinking about stories. You go to a movie, you're thinking about stories. You read a novel, obviously you're thinking about stories. But you're thinking about stories when you're watching the news. You're thinking about stories reading comic books. You're even thinking about stories playing video games. In fact, if you go and watch a sporting event, you're thinking about the stories. The story of defeat or victory of these usually two, opposing entities. And in fact, even when things seem very abstract, the great ballet choreography, George Balanchine, who was Georgian, by the way, half Georgian, said, people would say, there's just two people. What's the story? There's a man and a woman. He says, well, don't you understand? If you put a man and a woman on the stage dancing around each other, you already have a story. Because, of course, the story of male and female is one of the oldest and deepest stories we have. And I have thought about stories for years. I've thought about stories I write stories. You haven't seen many of them, and I do need to get my novel self-published this year, Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise. But of course, I'm always putting together a story of history. Every one of these videos is a story. There's a story behind it, how I came up with the idea. There's the little story that involves me setting up the camera, focusing it, deciding what I'm going to use as my style of photography. Also deciding how I came to this idea, what idea I'm even talking about. There are stories behind everything. Now, one thing that, shall we call them realists often say, is that stories are just an illusion in a sense, because things never end. So, maybe I die, but the world goes on without me. There's no end to the story. However, I think that's not exactly honest. And I think that the idea that stories don't actually exist, or certainly not in the form of a story, I think there's something dishonest to that. Because, in fact, every birth and every death is the beginning and the end of a story. And yes, there are stories that came before it. But we can say, circumscribed within that birth and death, is the life of a person. Now, they're set in an environment. They're set in a time. They're set in a country. They're set in a family. And of course, these things didn't start when I was born, nor do they end when I die or you die. And as far as we know through science, there is a beginning to this whole story of, we'll just call it the universe for a moment. But if you look at the Bible, there's a beginning to the story as well. You look at the story of Christ, there's a beginning to that story. And there are endings. For instance, we are now no longer in any degree related to the 20th century anymore. I mean, yes, the 20th century totally informs who we are. It is, to use that terrible phrase, our backstory. I hate that. The best word is history, not backstory. But story makes up everything. We tell each other stories. We tell each other jokes that are stories. We tell each other the incidents of the day. Of course, some people are better storytellers than others. And that's, how you tell a story is almost sometimes as important as what you tell. Two people can tell the same story and tell very different versions of that story. And we'll come to this concept in a moment when we talk about the next word, which will be narrative. But we have mythology. Those are stories. Legends, epics, those are stories. Romances, Gothic literature, detective stories, mysteries, action stories. They're all stories. And we as human beings seem to be creatures that get our central nutrition about meaning from the stories we consume.